Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Brooklands. Sorry about the temperature. I was going to say a very warm welcome, but it's been a bit of a pun. A special welcome to our guests this evening. And once again, thank you all for supporting the Trust. I've had the honour and privilege to organise and host these talks for the last 4 years. Seems like 40, but it's only 4. There's one name that has been at the top of my list, and that name is on the top of your list and hasn't gone away ever since I started. So will you please give a very warm welcome to Tony Brooks and Simon Taylor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fair to say that Great Britain produced 3 great Grand Prix drivers in the 1950s. Sterling Moss, Mike Hawthorne and Tony Brooks. Now in these days of worldwide TV audiences and million-dollar retainers and endless media conferences, this man would be as famous as Lewis Hamilton or Jenson Button. But I don't think he would have enjoyed it much. Tony has always been a man to let his performances on the track do the talking. So we're very honoured that he's agreed to come and spend the first evening with us, with Pina, a sportswoman herself. She was an international basketball player before she married Tony, and they've been together, I should point out, for 58 years. Now, because Tony is much too modest to recite the statistics of his career, I've just scribbled down a few of them. In 1958, in 1955, in his first Formula One race, I think his first single-seater race, he scored the first Grand Prix victory by a British driver in a British car since 1924. In his second World Championship Grand Prix, he finished second. In his third World Championship Grand Prix, he won. During his 3 seasons with Van Wall and with Ferrari, he won 50% of the Grand Prix that he finished. And I think I'm right in saying that during the 1950s, only Fangio, Ascari and Moss won more Grand Prix. It's amazing to realise it, but Tony's win at the British Grand Prix at Aintree in 1957, shared with Sterling Moss and the Van Wall, that's 60 years ago next month, so that's something we should draw a quick pint for. That win in 1957 in the British Grand Prix was the first ever win in a World Championship Grand Prix by a British car. And then when Van Wall withdrew, Tony was immediately hired as the number 1 at Ferrari. Well, Tony, you've always been a modest man. You've never made a fuss about your achievements. Do you sometimes feel that you've never really had the recognition that you deserve for your motor racing achievements?
No, not at all. I enjoyed motor racing, got tremendous satisfaction out of it, and I'm always prepared to be judged by my results, and I never had the ambition of trying to sort of publicise myself with the idea of sort of turning it into monetary return. We got prize money, we got some retainers in those days, but probably overstating their value when I said they're peanuts compared with today. But I was never interested. I mean, Sterling was a professional, he from beginning to end, and that was his life. And I think, I think motor racing was his life in many, many ways. So he maximised his publicity, which was necessary, and as a result, of course, he was still known worldwide as much, I think almost as much as when he was performing and winning Grand Prix. But no, I'm perfectly happy, and I'm extremely, well, I must to overdo it, but you've just given me a very good introduction, and that is a satisfaction in itself. And so the short answer to your question, which I've managed to lengthen quite a bit, is no, I hope never worry about not being receiving more publicity.
Well, you say that, excuse me, you say that Sterling Moss was always a professional. In your case, you were actually going to be a dentist.
Yes.
You never intended to be a racing driver.
Yeah.
You started off just doing it for fun. I'm going to press this magic device here. If it works, we should be able to see. No, not yet, but I'll keep trying. There we go. There is your first racing car.
Yes.
That is a Healy Silverstone, which was very much a road-going sports car.
Yes.
And I think while you were racing that, you were busy studying to be a dentist.
Yes, I was. Before I answer that question, I should perhaps have clarified my previous answer, and that is that although I was never professional like Sterling in terms of making motor racing my life, behind the wheel I was as totally committed as anybody else, because your life was on the line, particularly in the 1950s. So I was totally professional behind the wheel, but when I got out of the car, I was, Tony Brooks and just enjoying the environment. But coming back to your question, yes, it was my mother's Healy Silverstone there. And,
It's your mother's?
Well, yes, my mother's Healy
So
Silverstone.
did you always take your caps at one piece?
Well, yes, to start with, she had a TCMG, you see, and that wasn't really suitable for club motor racing. So I bought a book called by Charles Mortimer about racing in Healy Silverstone, and I read this book, and I thought, this sounds, very good and the ideal car. And I got my father and mother to read this book, and I sort of plowed through it and so on. And anyway, by the constant drip approach, I managed to suggest that we should change TCMG for a Healy Silverstone. And we actually found this one, when I say found, in an advert. It was in the West Country. And I think we paid, £700 for it. And I sold my motorbike. And with a bit of help from you know who, we managed to find the £700 and buy this car. And my mother was such a tremendous sport because, as you see, it was not exactly an ideal car for shopping. So she totally accepted the exchange of a lovely TCMG with another car. It was the first car I ever drove, had a beautiful gearbox. And she very sportingly agreed to swapping her TCMG for that car. So 2.5 litre Riley engine. And of course, one of the things that helped me to sell the car to the idea to my father and mother was that I had this book which showed how reliable it had been, and he even gave some expenses and so on. So it was, we weren't getting out of our depth or anything like that. It was a reasonable car. In fact, an ideal car for club motor race. It wasn't fast enough, but it was fast enough for me to get the feel about motor racing.
Well, you attracted enough attention to be able to be lent by. Is it going to come up? Yes, there it is. You've there got. Oh, sorry, I've overpressed it. There we go. 2 examples of the lovely Fraser National Law replica.
Yes.
And I think you're on the outside because they were overtaking around the outside.
Yes. Yes, I think that's right. Yes.
And that was obviously a much quicker car, a much more.
Yes, it was. Well, we were very fortunate because, of course, in those days the club meetings were really, really friendly. Club meetings, not like so-called club meetings today. Or some club meetings today, probably too. And so you get to know everybody. You had a problem, somebody would then you a bit, or this and that, the other. So I got to know a family called Healy, father and son. It was Arthur Healy and I've forgotten the son's Christian name. That's very bad. Anyway, it was a Healy family, spelled H-E-L-Y, funnily enough. And I got to know them very well. And his son had a Healy Silverstone as well, so the father had the Fraser-Nash and the son had the Healy Silverstone. And obviously we had an awful lot in common, we got to know each other very well. And Mr. Healy, Arthur Healy, yes, very kindly invited me to try his car. And so once I started to drive his car, he sort of, he stopped driving himself. And this was a tremendous step up for me in motor racing, because that was fast enough to win, 5 lap, 10 lap races.
And you attracted enough attention to be put into a works Fraser-Nash, or the second car.
Yeah.
There at the Goodwood chicane, chasing what looks to be like a Lotus Bristol, Lotus 10, probably.
No, I think it's a Lotus, yes.
So
might even be, yes.
Now there you are in a works, that's the Works Mark II, the long replica.
Yeah.
Did Fraser-Nash, did the Aldington brothers actually pay you any money, or did they just say...
No, they didn't. To be honest, the car was not as well prepared as a Healy car. It was a great disappointment.
Really?
Yeah. And it's, it looks so different, and they take weight off here, weight off there. So it wasn't a good car, to be honest, and I think they probably had a little bit more power than the Healy car.
But you did then race, did you not, Fraser-Nash at the Dundrod race?
Yes,
which must have been the first.
Absolutely, yes, but that was a private car. That was Stoop, I think, from to...
Dickie Stoops.
Dickie Stoop, I think. Or, no, it was another gentleman. But they said they were two friends together. And I think it was entered in the name of the works, but it's actually a private car.
But Dundrod must have been quite a step up for you, because that was a narrow, fast Irish road circuit, just Irish lanes, really.
Yes.
Nothing like racing round developed aerodrome circuits like Silverstone.
No, it's absolutely true. But I found it much more interesting, more fascinating. I mean, it was real road racing. But the thing is I never drove the car with the idea of finishing off the circuit. So whether in fact it was a grass and a white line, or whether it was a brick wall, and there weren't any difference to me. It didn't have any impact on me. I just enjoyed it that much more because it was a great challenge.
Well, now, your performance in that Fraser-Nash attracted the attention of John Dwyer, and you found yourself with a works drive for Aston Martin. But what I want to move on to now is this story which, if you read it in a bad motor racing novel, you wouldn't really believe it. Here is this dental surgeon who is rung up at the hospital where he's working by the head of the Connaught Formula One team and asked if you could get the next weekend off from your medical work to go to southern Italy and drive in your first Formula One race. Actually, I think your first single-seater race.
Well, it's the first time I ever sat in a Formula One car. It was at Syracuse, in fact.
And I think when you got there, you had to take various aeroplanes to get there.
Yes.
You were on the planes for 8 hours.
Yes.
And is it right that you were sitting on these rather noisy, slow aeroplanes with your dental studies on your lap, studying for your next dental exam?
Yeah, well, certainly, yes. I didn't want to waste any time because the principal at the dental college took a very good view, or a very encouraging view, I should say, of my involvement. But I didn't want to prejudice his goodwill by in any way falling behind in my dental studies. So maybe I studied a lot harder and did a lot better than I would have done if I wasn't motor racing, if you understand. Yes, I did. I didn't have to waste any time because I suppose there's a slight guilt complex there that I shouldn't really be at home in the dental hospital. So I did manage to work them in between motor racing commitments, in between my dental commitments. But I was fortunate in that as you progress, it was a 5.5-year course. We did quite a few years of the medical course. plus our own subjects. So it was 5.5 years. But I was fortunate in that as my motor racing proceeded, so I moved further on in my studies, and the more mature you were regarded to be, and therefore the more you trusted. You know, if you missed a lecture, it wasn't going to be the end of the world, and you were going to catch up with your friends' notes and so on and so forth. And when I got to the stage, you see, when I was racing at Goodwood, it was just a Saturday. And we would drive down on Friday night and stay at a bed and breakfast at Bonneries, my father and I, occasionally my brother Paul. And so it was, I was only losing, well, probably less than half a day, the Friday. We would drive down on the Friday night, Friday evening, Friday night, and race on the Saturday, and drive back on the Saturday after the race. So we just had one bed and breakfast in Brooklands and be back. So then when I started to get more involved and needed more time off, you know, I was at the stage the clinical stage, where I could organise my appointments and so on and so forth to fit in with the slightly extra time I needed. So in that sense, my progression in the motor racing world coincided quite nicely with my progression in the mental world. So I was fortunate in that respect.
Let's talk about Syracuse. I think you got there after this slightly gruelling trip to find that this car that you never sat in, which you were expected to race against the works Maseratis and so on on the Sunday, hadn't arrived.
Yeah.
So when it finally did arrive,
yeah.
I mean, you barely had time to find out where the pedals were before you were on the track for practice.
Well, that is true. But the mechanics, the team was run by Mike Oliver. He was in charge of the team, and he was having kittens, you know, when they didn't arrive, as you can imagine, because he was coming down in his own car, and of course the mechanics were in their car, their truck, and of course he was being put through it. And anyway, they eventually arrived at Syracuse, and they did a fantastic job of repairing that car. It was absolutely immaculate. Although I forget how many they told in the book, but I don't know how many days they spent, but it was ages and ages and ages. And in fact, they had a problem with the customs initially when they got into France or into Belgium, I think it was. So they lost days there arguing with the customs there. Unfortunately, there was one mechanic who I think had a mother who was French, and he managed to sort of smooth them down and get them through. So anyway, they eventually arrived, and well, they made up for the lost time. They repaired the car immaculately. It was beautifully polished, and there couldn't possibly be any complaint about the condition of the car.
But you had to learn the circuit.
Yes.
And learn the car.
Yes.
When you went out and practice.
Yes.
And you qualified, I think, on the front row.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Yes. Well, yes. We made the best of the time, the practice time we had. I think.
I told you he was a modest man.
Well, I'll tell you right. So I think I had a very slow spin actually on one corner, one into the pit straight, and but it was a very, very slow one. No, I guess there was some oil put down, and but I didn't spot it. So that was the only sort of slight blemish. But I didn't touch anything. It was very slow, one of these very slow, not even spin.
Well, moving on then to the race.
Yes.
You won the race.
Yes. Well, the most surprised person was me, followed by the journalists, and followed by a very sympathetic, very extraordinary spectators, because they had come here there to expect the Maserati team to run away with everything, because after Mercedes, Maserati was the team to beat at that time.
Sure.
And Mercedes had just retired, I think, a few weeks beforehand. And I think the Sicilians and the people from mainland Italy had come to encourage and applaud a Maserati walkover. But amazingly enough, they took very well the situation, and it was very encouraging, very enthusiastic. And in actual fact, I was moving around. I learned the circuit. I should have mentioned this. I learned the circuit on a Vespa. We didn't weren't able to afford hire cars in those days, so I hired a Vespa and I learnt the circuit. I learnt it in the sense of which way, what was coming up next, but you couldn't learn it in a racing sense, but at least if you knew which way the road was going was a start. And so I've been moving around with this Vespa, and when I won the race, I was a little bit overwhelmed, because people were, sort of, excited and congratulating me and beating me on the back and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, oh my goodness, this was completely new to me. And my first thought was I wanted to get away and into the hotel room and have a nice shower. So the first thing was I dashed to the back of the where I'd left the scooter, and it was still there, so that was a good start. Before I came out to Syracuse, I had a crown, the upper left crown, replaced, and I'd had a temporary one put in, which was only temporary. So I've been doing an awful lot of kilometres on this scooter, as you can imagine, trying to learn this circuit, and to the point where I got a really red raw inner aspect of my first finger and my thumb. It must have been this one, and it was red raw, and I've had taken to having to bind it with handkerchief, so that it didn't get even more raw. So I put my handkerchief around here by the scooter, ready to dive off, and I put it around here. I put it like this, and what you do, you put it in here, and you tighten it like that, don't you? My temporary crown finished on the floor. So there I was with all these enthusiastic Italians around me, sort of, and I was desperately trying to find this tooth on the floor. Trying to tell them to step back because I didn't want to lose this crown. But anyway, it was too late, and I never found it. And
so that was an extraordinary introduction to the world of international Grand Prix.
Well, that's right, yes, a real star performance.
Well, when you got back to England, and this was, as I said in the introduction, the first time that a British driver and a British car had won a race called a Grand Prix, because remember, there wasn't just the World Championship Grand Prix in those days, there were also significant races elsewhere around Europe called Grand Prix. It was the first time that a British car and a British driver had won a Grand Prix since 1924. So it was making the headlines by the time you got home. You suddenly found, to your surprise, and probably not to your pleasure, you were a famous man. And then the offers started to come in, and there's so much we can talk about. I mean, just briefly, you accepted a Formula One drive with BRM, and that was one of your race at Silverstone for BRM was one of the two races, you say, in your career when you didn't follow your own rule of always racing a car which you knew was mechanically as it should be. Just tell us about the Silverstone accident with the BRM.
Yes. Well, before I come to that, as a result of my win at Syracuse, I was offered Connaught, of course, wanted me to drive for them, and it might appear ungrateful of myself not to go for Connaught. But the trouble is, the car was basically unreliable, and it hadn't been going very well. It had a wonderful chassis, wonderful brakes, but what it was short of was an engine. And the engine it had was a 2-litre. I'm sorry, perhaps I'm leaning one way. It's 2.5. It was a 2-litre Ultra engine from before the war. Was brought out to 2.5 litre, and it didn't have enough power, and it was unreliable. And in fact, for most of the race, I was, using less than maximum revs. So, a great chassis, great brakes, but the basic problem was the engine, and so that's why I didn't feel that it would have been right to go to Connaught. Unfortunately, subsequently, they didn't do very well because they didn't have the car. Oddly enough, Connaught had an ideal 2.5 litre engine, but for some reason they never released it. And I think if Connaught had been able to get that 2.5 litre engine, you know, it could have been a very different story for them. But anyway, that's by the by. Ron Walker also offered me a drive because he had a Connaught, and the third offer was BRM. And they never got that car anywhere near right. It would never drift. The engine was good. In the straight line, it had good performance, good acceleration, which is why Mike and I Mike Hawthorne and I led the British Grand Prix for the first 4 or 5 laps, I think it was, because we had a good straight line performance off the line, and but it could never drift the car. So anyway, in the race, the accelerator linkage broke, and I stopped at Stoke Corner, and somebody helped me to lash up a connection, and I managed to get the car back to the pits.
Is it right that you actually borrowed his fountain pen and used his pen or his pencil?
I don't know. I can't verify that, but I had some help.
This is what some unreliable journalists wrote.
Trying to gloss it up a bit, but I don't remember that, I have to say. But anyway, we got it back to the pits, and then they did what they thought was an adequate repair, and I lost about, I don't know, 9 laps. I mean, all I can do now, bearing in mind that the only performance I'd given that indicating I might have something Grand Prix capability was at Syracuse, which was a one-off, and it was in July, and Syracuse was at October. So I thought, well, I can't get anywhere in this race because, as I say, 9 laps or something, I was in the pits. But I thought what I can do is try and demonstrate that I can drive a car quickly. But anyway, when I got back in the race, this job they'd done on the accelerator was that it was sticking on some of the corners. It wasn't coming off straight away. Stoke Corner I'd been taken flat out. But of course, in the 9 laps I'd been in the pits, some more rubber and oil had been deposited. So, but anyway, I came to Stowe, bearing in mind I was trying to demonstrate that, Syracuse wasn't a fluky one-off. And I thought, well, this is flat. So I went into it flat. So all I needed was just a quick like that. It would have been sufficient, which if the accelerator working properly, it wouldn't have been a problem. So, but it didn't come off. With any decent handling car, all I would have to have done would have been to go along the grass verge, for 50 yards or so, and edge back onto the road. But immediately anything untoward happened with that car, completely out of control. So it span around and finished up on the outside of the circuit and turned over and threw me out. The only decent thing it did was it at least deposited me on the grass rather than on the macadam, and also it recognised the error of its ways and set itself on fire.
I haven't been doing my job very well because I forgot that we've got some more lovely pictures over here, so let's go quickly through. There is Tony winning the Syracuse Grand Prix in the Connaught, and just to bring it up to date, I think we've also got a picture of Tony driving the same car in a demonstration of Goodwood Revival. And a very pretty car, I always thought, the Connaught, and beautifully turned out, of course. Yes. But now we're going to move on from BRM because you moved on in 1957 to Van Wall, but you also, in those days, Formula One drivers liked to work every weekend, and so not only were you a works driver for Van Wall in Formula One, you were also a works driver for Aston Martin,
Yes.
in sports car racing,
Yes.
in which you were very successful. But the British Grand Prix in 1957, it was at Aintree, and it came, 3 weeks, 4 weeks after the Le Mans 24 hours.
That's right, yes.
When you'd been driving for Aston Martin.
Yes.
And that was the other of the two occasions
Yes.
when you broke your own rule
Absolutely.
about not driving a car that wasn't properly
Absolutely.
set up. So tell us about the Mans.
Well, you mentioned the rule. I didn't mention the rule because I thought it would come up about Le Mans. But BRM was the first regulation, the first rule.
Indeed.
The first thing I said, look, you were a lunatic. You know, that car wasn't fit to drive, and it was only a question of really cruising down, around and finishing. But you said I was so intent on trying to show that Syracuse wasn't just a one-off, and that was absolute lunacy. So I said, look, don't do this again. Driving a car which is not fit to be driven at the limit of its normal capability. So at 57 at Le Mans, I was driving with Noel Cunningham-Reid, and he was a very, very good driver. We won the 1,000 kilometres together. He brought it in about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were in second place. And he said that, it was stuck in fourth gear. And I thought, well, okay, that's exactly what I had at Spa a few weeks before, and I managed to get it out of gear and won the race. So I thought, clever clogs, I can do this again. So I got the car out of the pits, having to slip the clutch because I was stuck in the top gear. Anyway, got it out and the pits, and the first straight I came to after the pits, there's a sort of a right, and then a left, and then a right, and then there's a short straight to Tech Rouge into the straight.
Sure.
There's a very short straight there. And I thought, well, this is 3 o'clock in the morning, lying in second place. Don't want to stop, dropping around the field, and I must get this out of gear, out of fourth gear, as soon as I possibly can. First straight that comes along, I have to do it here, So what I was doing was accelerating hard, and then pressing the clutch, and then trying to, when I lifted it hard and then off, and as I pulled my foot off the accelerator, I would simultaneously try to pull the gear lever out, or the other way, I can't remember, to pull it out of fourth gear into fifth gear. I was synchronising hard acceleration, hard pull on the gear lever to try and pull it out. And of course, then I was doing the first thing that you're told, or one of the first things you're told when you start to drive, is don't ever look down at the gear lever. So what was I doing? I was looking down at the gear lever and, accelerating, boom, And then I looked up and I passed my braking point. Mistake number one. Mistake number two was that I tried to get round the corner, and in fact I put it on a perfectly good line, although I was going too quickly, on a perfectly good line, in a drift, and clipped the apex quite correctly, and on the exit, unfortunately, the sand which they use outside Tech Rouge came literally down to the edge of the road. There was no grass verge, nothing, just sand right to the edge of the road. So I finished the pit, went drift wide, and then started running up the bank like that. And of course, it was never designed to do rallies, so the Aston Martin flipped over like that and trapped me in underneath. And so there I was lying underneath this car at 3 o'clock in the morning, darkness, but nobody could see me because I was round the corner past the apex in any case. So I wondered whether was it going to be a straight run-over job, or was I going to be cremated, one or the other it could have been. Anyway, fortunately, an Italian driver came round, his name escapes me just at the moment, a lovely nice guy. He came round, and his Aston Martin was that was the sandbank, and the Aston Martin was like this, and my tail was sticking out into the road. And he came round the bend and just kept it far enough out to just clip the back of my car, the back of my Aston Martin, which tipped it off me, and it allowed me to get up and from underneath the car and run up the sandbank. I don't know, run, scramble up the sandbank and collapse into the hands of an astonished flag marshal. So I was extremely lucky there, and I wish I could remember the name. A wonderful chap who, unfortunately, he had to retire, and I apologise profusely to him, the Porsche driver. He was very well known. Anyway, so I was very thankful to him, to say the very least, and I thanked him afterwards and apologised to him, causing him to retire.
Well, that's going to bring us to this picture here, because you did hurt yourself at F1.
Well, yes, before I come to that, I just explained that this was following up to what I said. This is my second decision, my second experience, which said you don't ever try and race a car at its maximum performance if it's not fit to race. So this was a convincing number two. But you see, funnily enough, neither were driving accidents. They were stupidities. I should have recognised that Bayern was, not fit to drive fast, and I should have recognised that you don't mess about with the gear lever and miss the braking point. So they weren't driving errors as such. They weren't, mistake in driving decision. It was a thicko mistake.
Well, we're going to. There's so much of your career we can talk about, and we're going to have to compress bits of it. But we are going to come to the race of America, where many of us believe you could well have been the 1959 world champion, except you decided to exercise your rule.
Yes.
But let's come back from Le Mans. You did bash yourself around quite badly in that accident.
Yeah.
We get to the British Grand Prix,
Yeah.
which was held in Aintree that year.
Yes.
You see all the traditional grandstands on the left of the picture for the horse racing track.
Yeah.
And Van Wall, it was really a kind of battle between the Van Walls and the Ferraris that season.
Yes.
And you and Sterling Moss, Maserati too.
Yeah.
You and Sterling Moss were in the works Van Walls,
Yes.
and you both practiced, even though you weren't physically at your best. I think you almost equalled Sterling's pole position time. I think you were a fifth of a second slower or something.
Yes, I equalled the lap record, and Sterling was, it was 2/10 of a second between us in his car. Yeah.
So obviously, despite the fact that you were still really not recovered from that accident, you were absolutely as quick. The race started, Sterling was leading, I think you were running in second or third place, and then Sterling's car hit trouble, and so he had to come in and stop in the pits.
Yes.
Now, how did it work that did you take the decision to stop? Were you feeling that your injuries were hurting you too much? Why did you then stop?
No, it was prearranged, you see. That, the reason, I shouldn't really been allowed to start the race. I wasn't fit to start the race. I was in bed until the Tuesday before the practicing started on the Thursday. The first time I drove the car after the Le Mans accident was my father's car to go to Aintree, and I lost an awful lot of weight as a result of this accident, obviously, as I say, I managed to bluff my way through the so-called medical, as they were in those days, and but I shouldn't really been allowed to race. Obviously, if we're going to start 3 cars, there's a better chance of being successful than if you start 2. So it's deciding, although I say I managed to get permission to start, I decided that although I was as fast saying that I couldn't do 90 laps in a competitive race because I just wasn't fit. I had rubber all over me to protect me in the cockpit. So it was clear I couldn't do a competitive 90 laps, which is what the race was. So I agreed beforehand that if Sterling or Stewart had a problem with their cars, I would bring my car in and they would take over. So so it wasn't decided in the race; it was decided beforehand.
So they hung out a pit signal
Yes.
to tell you that Sterling had stopped.
Yeah.
But what has always fascinated me is that you handed your car, which was healthy, over to Sterling, and Sterling got the lead back, and so between you won the race. In the same car, you started it, he finished it. But is it right that you then, despite the fact that you were in a lot of pain, you then got into Sterling's car, which hadn't been going particularly well, and you rejoined the race?
Yes, that's correct, because, as I say, we were trying to, you have 3 cars running, you've got a better chance of doing well, but because his was a misfiring problem, and, I'm sure as many people here have had the experience that sometimes misfires can kill themselves, not very often. So I thought, look, I should give it a try in case it does clear itself, and I did exactly that. And but unfortunately, it didn't clear itself, and the problem, the likelihood was I was just going to bust an engine, which the manual could do without.
Well, nevertheless, Sterling in the car that you'd started, there is the start, incidentally, with, I think it's Sterling with the white ring round his air intake, and you in the van wall with
the yellow.
Yes. And who's in that Maserati? Who would that be?
Yes, I'm on the left there because I'm on the
and Sterling's
front road.
Yeah.
It
is Barrow, is it? Thank you very much.
Yes, it is Barrow.
It's Barrow.
Yeah.
Right,
Barrow and I did equal the fastest lap, equal the lap record. So we did exactly the same time. He was in the centre because he did it before me.
I see.
But Sterling was actually a second slower when he tried my car, but he had a new car and he finished up with 0.2 of a second faster in his car. But that was just practice, and I say 90 laps I could not.
Well, there you are in
the
car. That's in the car that you started, so that's the car that went on to win.
Yes.
Wonderful shot at entry, and if I can conjure up, there is the aftermath.
Yes.
With you and Sterling and the winner's car. And of course, both of you showing this used to happen particularly in the van wall, as it did in the Mercedes. You all saw Sterling having what he said were his owl eyes.
Yes.
But both of you have had so much oil and rubber coming out of the front.
Yes. Well,
So
there's also brake lining, which is more worrying. The cancer subject, isn't it?
Well, of course.
Yes, the brake linings. Yes, indeed.
Well, that was, as I said earlier, that was the first time that the British Grand Prix had been won by a British driver. And that was a great day, really. We're also used to Britain as they became, when we went to Cooper and to Lotus, Britain became the dominant force in Grand Prix racing.
Yes.
But Van Wall, with Tony van der Velde's persistence and expenditure of huge sums of money, he was really in the vanguard of the British motor racing industry.
Yes, indeed. Yes, that was tremendous credit to Tony van der Velde what he achieved. Of course, it was that was the first time that British car and drivers had won a World Championship Grand Prix. Indeed, the first time that a British car and driver had won a Grand Prix was Syracuse.
So you were responsible for both?
Well, yes. I wrote an article for, I think it was Motorsport, and I headed it jumping the second fence at Aintree. They didn't use it, which rather niggling. The second fence being,
absolutely,
from a non-World Championship event to a World Championship event.
Well, let's stay with Van Wall for a little while, because we now move on to the next season, 1958, and that's a wonderful shot of Spa, Belgian Grand Prix in 1958,
Yes.
with Moss and Brooks at the front. You actually, in 1958, won 3 Grand Prix. You won that Belgian Grand Prix, you won the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, which we're particularly going to talk about in a minute, and you won the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. And I'm sure you all remember that 1958 was the year when all the Formula One circus arrived for the final race of the year at Casablanca. They used to have a Grand Prix there on the northern African coast. And the situation was that if Sterling Moss in the Van Wall could win and set fastest lap, and Mike Hawthorne finished no higher than 3rd,
Correct.
then Sterling would have been champion.
Yeah.
Well, Sterling did what he had to do, and he won and set fastest lap. Tony was in 2nd place, and sadly, and I think Hawthorne was in 4th, with Phil Hill and the other Ferrari in 3rd place.
Yes.
Sadly, your Van Wall failed.
Yes.
Hawthorne, of course, was then able, under team orders, don't know what Vettel would think about this, but Hawthorne was able to be waved past by Phil Hill. He finished 2nd, he won the World Championship by 1 point.
Yeah.
But let's stick with that 1958 season, because you really, I think that was your greatest year, wasn't it? And the German Grand Prix surely was your greatest race.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yes. Obviously, I only finished 3rd in the World Championship in 58, where I was 2nd in 59. So, in terms of Grand Prix, yes, it was the best year. And of course, I think that they were the 2 greatest races, really. Spa, Nürburgring, and Monza. So I won the 3, I think, the Triple Crown, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this shot, with you with a thermos flask of, I don't know what might be in there, but this is when you have just won the German Grand Prix.
Yes.
And Sterling, who'd retired, is wearing a rather dinky cardigan, complete with BRDC badge. But that race, an extraordinary drive from you, because you came from behind. The 2 Ferraris of Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorne were leading. We're talking about the Nürburgring, 40.5 miles round, surely the most demanding Grand Prix circuit of all. And I think you had to make, 20 seconds up on the Ferrari, something like that.
No, I think it's more than that. I can't, without checking it up, it's more than that. But I caught them up at a better pace than Fangio had the year before, which really made the race for me, because it was, the 58 and 57, there were a very similar situation and that Hawthorne and Collins fighting against Fangio the previous year, and Hawthorne and Collins fighting against Brooks in 58. And so I got Ferrari's times, and Maserati's times, and compared them with my own, and it was very, very, very encouraging. And so that's why I'm such a great circuit, to be able to catch and overtake Mike and Peter, who were obviously two great drivers, was very, very pleasing. And,
would you say that the Ferraris had more power than Van Wall? They were quicker in a straight line. You had to do all the work on the corners.
Yes, that's right. We had devices of disc brakes, but although you've got to stop quite a lot on the Nürburgring, it's not continuous. There wasn't a lot of, they weren't getting up at a lot of speed between the corners. So we had devices on the disc brakes, but the Van Wall, I went. The Van Wall won the World Manufacturers Championship in '58, so it's I'm not. What works, if it works, don't fix it. But in actual fact, Sterling will tell you it was not an easy car to drive. He didn't really like to drift, one managed to drift with some sort of it having very long and ponderous gear change. But we managed to make it work, and it was, he won the World Motorsport Championship, so that is what really matters. But it wasn't an easy car to drive. And so the Ferrari had the advantage of the straight, because I overtook them more than once, on the back sections, and then they just sailed by me on the straight. And my difficulty was trying to build up a big enough lead on the back section to give them too much distance to take me on the straight. So this is what we were trying to do. And poor old Peter was trying. He'd seen how much I got pulled out, and Peter was trying to sort of close the gap on me. Because he knew what was going to happen if he didn't close the gap.
Were you able to?
That was when he was just,
Did you see his accident whereas you moved too far?
No. In the book, it does. He was about 20-30 yards behind me, but I couldn't see it. I only knew something must have happened. I got into the straight, because that's on the Nürburgring. There's not much time to look in the mirror.
Sure.
On the straight, obviously got some time. And when he didn't appear in my mirror, I expected him to be in the mirrors on my tail, and about to try and shoot past. But there's no sign of it. And I thought the worst. But I didn't thought the worst. I thought, he must have had a mechanical failure or an accident of some time. But of course, I had no idea that it was as serious as it turned out to be.
There you are, looking happy after the race, because nobody knew. In fact, Mike Hawthorne, who obviously was Peter's great friend,
yes,
his Ferrari failed, I think, on the same lap.
Yes.
And he got a marshal to get on a field telephone. Incredible to think. There weren't even proper communications back to the pits in those days. But he persuaded a marshal to make some sort of contact with race control on the field telephone, and was told that Peter Collins was bruised but okay.
Yes.
And I think that was why you were able to look pretty happy.
Oh, I know.
Because you had no idea until much later that Collins had been killed.
And there's also one on me with a wreath around my neck. I still didn't know. So at least I was able to enjoy the success of the race, before the truth came through, which was some time after the race. And obviously, I don't think anybody was in a big hurry to tell me about it.
We ought to just mention this, because it is always a source of astonishment to younger motor racing enthusiasts to comprehend that so many people got killed. That year,
yes,
3 Formula 1 drivers died,
yes,
including your own teammate Stuart Lewis Evans at Casablanca.
Yes.
Motor racing was enormously dangerous then. The tracks would have, sometimes like at the Nürburgring, barbed wire beside the track. And there were all sorts of trees and buildings and all sorts of things to hit. No seat belts in the cars. The cars were much more fragile in their construction. So you, who always wanted to make a rule not to drive a car that wasn't mechanically right, you were obviously aware of the danger. You were obviously aware that your friends, who we might meet at breakfast, wouldn't be around at dinner.
Correct.
How did that strike you? How did you deal with that?
The thing is that I drove up to the maximum of my ability. I never ever forced myself. I say my 2 accidents were stupidity, as I've already said, not driving errors. So I was confident that I was driving up to the limit of my ability and not beyond. And I never, like a certain person, admitted to having to sort of close his eyes, in order to take a corner flat at Syracuse. I would never ever do anything like that. I would drive it up to the limit of my capabilities, and that was it. And hopefully it was fast enough in order to win the race. So I was never contemplating that I would be overstepping the limit, but nevertheless I accepted that circumstances could arise beyond my control. Oil on the circuit was a very common problem in those days. You go around a corner and somebody's, spun round and in the middle of the road. So there were circumstances like that beyond their control, and you accepted that that was a possibility. But, you know, hopefully it was not a very high probability that you could be caught up in that situation. The main thing was your own driving ability. If you drove up to the limits of your own capability, you know, you minimise the chances of, an accident. The biggest problem is, of course, that because of the type of roads we were racing on in those days, ordinary roads or roads made very similar to them, you could come across anything, as you touched on earlier. If you lose, you were entirely, any one mistake could be your last in those days because of the type of roads we were racing on. You lose control, whether you hit a pole or rolled over in a ditch or even a telephone booth, that was entirely beyond your control. Once you lost it, so any one mistake could be fatal in those days because of the type of roads you were racing on.
Well, that was 1958, and there's Italy, excuse me, with Mike Hawthorne congratulating you. Mike Hawthorne, as we've said earlier, did win the World Championship that year by 1 point, but that was a great victory, one of those three, as Tony says, the Triple Crown of Spa, Nürburgring and Monza for him all in 1 year. Mike Hawthorne retired after winning the World Championship that year, and as we all know, tragically died in January in a road accident. But is it true that when he decided to retire, he said to you, Tony, you ought to retire too, you're married to Pina now, why don't you stop?
Well, in fact, he said this to Pina. Where is Pina? She's right there. She's there, yeah. Because she said, yes, we were at, I think it was a BLDC dinner in London, wasn't it? And Mike, you came across him in the corridor, I think, and that was when Mike said to you, he never actually said it to me, he said it to Pina. He said, you know, really, this is, of course, after Peter's death, we really, Tony ought to give up motor racing, it's much too dangerous these days. But I don't recall him ever actually saying to me, but it was his definite view, yes.
Well, let's now, that moves us neatly into the 1959 season, because you always loved, I think, racing a British car. You were patriotic, as racing drivers were in those days.
Yes.
But Vanwall withdrew,
Yes.
and instantly Ferrari wanted you to become their number one driver.
Yes.
And there you are in Portugal,
Yes.
in the Ferrari.
Yes.
You actually won the French Grand Prix at Queens, and we saw a little clip of that earlier on.
Yes.
But you also won the German Grand Prix the year it was at Arvus. We have a picture of it,
That's
unfortunately, but that was on that ferocious banking.
That's
brick
right.
banking.
Yes.
I mean, we can talk about banking here because, of course, we're at Brooklands, but the Arvus race was pretty terrifying. 2 lengths of Autobahn with an enormous banking at the end.
Yes.
Was that a completely different race to what you were used to? Did it require a different technique?
Well, yes. Well, I don't know a different technique, but it was a very different race, and the geometry of the back corner was not right. In other words, the angle, the curvature and the angle were not related. You see, if they were related correctly, you should be able to go around beautifully at a constant speed, and you'd be feeling pretty good about it. But somebody did some work on it, and because the angle of the banking, or the sharpness of the corner in relation to the angle of the banking, there is a relationship that you get a balance whereby it can be much easier to drive that corner if you get those two related correctly. Somebody did that, I don't know, some geometrician, I suppose. And that hadn't been done properly. So you really had to watch it. You were drifting round there, much of that corner. And it's, of course, Paul Bearer lost his life, John Bearer lost his life in the sports car race the day before when it was wet. And it was wet, the circuit was wet just before the Grand Prix. So we were not exactly looking forward to the situation, but it mostly dried out before they actually dropped the starter's flag. And but I don't think a particularly different technique, other than trying to, I suppose, trying to cope with the fact that this was a peculiar corner and didn't quite respond as you would normally expect a corner to respond.
What about the differences between Vanwall, which was very British? I mean, you had three British drivers, totally a British team. You then went to Scuderia Ferrari. I think you said once you had Mr. Vandervelde coming to every race with his white straw hat, always there.
Yes.
Enzo Ferrari never turned up. Just came sometimes to practice at Monza.
Once at Monza, to my knowledge, yes.
What about the atmosphere within the team? How did it differ between Vanwall and Ferrari?
Well, Vanwall were very professional, but very British. Ferrari were, they were professional, but not quite as tightly run as the Vanwall team. But they raced with their hearts, and their reaction was noticeably more warm, enthusiastic, and dare one say Italian, than most people. So they were both two very, very professional teams. But Vanwall was a slightly tighter ship, rather tighter ship, and they were very enthusiastic when you won. But the Italians would be that much.
Sure.
You might say over the top, but
and driving a Ferrari at Monza
yes.
in front of that crowd must be quite something.
Well, yes, but I only drove in practice. I mean, that was where I lost one of the three places. I lost the World Championship in '59. I only drove Ferrari in practice there, and I think I was pole next to Sterling on the starting line. I mean, 0.2 of a second, I think it was, maybe 1/10 of a second slower than Sterling. And really looking forward to the race. But I don't know whether I want to get into this, but they at the end of practice, which I said the only time I drove a Ferrari around Monza in front of the adoring crowd, was at the end of that practice, I commented, and this comment I wish I'd never ever made more than any other comment. I think I regret making. As I said, I think I started a little bit of Frodo when at the end of my last lap, I was trying to better Sterling's time, and of course Frodo means sort of smell of learning, and of course I said I think it's the brakes, because I was really trying maximum to get the fastest lap, and of course what did they do? They interpreted that it was a clutch. No, but what's the clutch? I know whether it was a clutch or not, because you have so what they did, they changed the clutch overnight, and on the Ferrari, without any reference to me, which I suppose there's no obligation to that, but when I only expressed some concern about this smell of Frodo, they didn't discuss it with me. They're perfectly within their rights not to. And of course, what happened is I started the race, and within 100 metres, the clutch had burnt out. So either it was faulty clutch, or they fitted it incorrectly. And I'd never, ever burned out a clutch on a car in the whole of my racing career. And as Phil Hill finished second in that race, and I think I've been every time we finished the race,
Yeah. Well, nevertheless, you arrived at the final round of the World Championship at Watkins Glen?
Yes, at US Grand Prix, the Sebring.
Sebring, of course, it was at Sebring, right? And you were still in with a chance of winning the World Championship. And I don't know if we've got the next
I'm Sterling driver myself.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that is Sebring.
yes, it is.
The significant thing here is that Sterling retired, Brabham only finished fourth.
Yeah.
So if you'd been able to keep going, you would have been world champion, virtually without doubt. But in the early laps, you were hit from behind by your own teammate Von Trips, and you then had to make a decision.
Yes.
Not knowing if your car had been damaged.
Yes.
Should you keep going, or should you make a pit stop?
Yes. Well, I don't know whether you want to know the background to that before we come to that point, because the thing is, Harry Shell was a bit of a joker. He was an Anglo-American, Franco-American, and he was a bit of a joker. But the thing is, he did the lap, was credited with the lap for the US Grand Prix 59 that he never ever did, because this was a terrible circuit. I wish it had been the other circuit you mentioned, the Grand Prix, because this was a dreadful aerodrome circuit marked out with cones. And Harry Shell had in fact cut off one of these corners, just bypassed one of these cones. And he was credited with a lap that he never ever did. 7 seconds out. And I was in fact third fastest in practice, and Sterling was first, I was second, and I was third fastest on a totally unsuitable circuit for the Ferrari, etc. And he was credited with this lap he never ever did, and there was a big hoo-ha on the start line, and he didn't sort of say, no, I cut the corner, and the officials let him get away with it. Romolo Tavoni, who was the team manager of Ferrari, did his best. I didn't interfere because I didn't think it was for the driver to, and I could no more. I couldn't say more than Tavoni could say anyway. And so they upheld his claim that he did his fastest lap. The net result was, instead of me being on the front row next to Brabham, next to Sterling and Brabham, Sterling and Jack, I was moved to the second row, which may not seem to the end of the world, and I moved to the second row and on the other side of the grid, in fact, behind Sterling. But the trouble is, it put me in front of Von Trips, who was known to have his incidents, and he was most concerned in trying to get himself a permanent place in the Ferrari Formula 1 team. And here he was right behind me as a result of Harry Shell insisting on this lap time. He was a metre behind me, and I think he made the simple conclusion that the best way to try and get a team place with Ferrari would be to follow the team leader, which I was as number one. And so that's exactly what he did. He followed me so close on the first lap, he rammed me up the backside. And so I had to pull off and try and decide what to do about the situation. So anyway, it would not immobilise the car. I managed to I didn't lose the engine, and I managed to start, and I had half a lap to get back to the pits, and in that half lap, I must have seemed like a year long, because I had to decide whether I honoured my guarantee to myself, don't ever race a car that is mechanically below its ability to race at its maximum speed. Should I do that, or should I go in and check whether this car is fit to drive or not? Half a lap is not very long to sort of try and decide, but I'm very proud of myself to in fact decide and make myself, and that was it. I had to make myself go in the pits to have this car checked, to satisfy myself that I wasn't going to make a third, and possibly fatal mistake, persevering with a car that wasn't fit to be raced to the maximum. So I went in, and in actual fact, there was nothing major wrong. But you see, that leaves you with the thought, afterwards, oh, if only I had done this. So it's no use reliving things. I would do the same thing again. And it was because of those two incidents we covered at some length earlier on that made me do that. And that cost me the championship because, as you already mentioned, Sterling retired and Jack ran out of petrol, which is something he did, I wouldn't say regularly, but he did from time to time, because he would always squeeze out an extra gallon of petrol, take a gallon of petrol out of the car to get the weight down, so he ran out of petrol. Sterling was out, so if we're not for that, I wouldn't be world champion, but it's only. But of course there were other occasions in that season which you may not wish to go into, where I would have had enough points anyway without that unfortunate contretemps, which was indirectly responsibility of Harry Shell.
Tony, we could continue. We've got so much that we haven't even touched on. Our time is running out. We haven't talked about your sports car racing, particularly with Aston Martin. You also drove when you were with Ferrari in sports cars. Your Formula 1 career continued with BRM and Newman Credit. You'll have to come back and give us another hour or so of your time so that we can get on with that. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Brooks.
Where did the hour and a quarter go? Fantastic. Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Simon. I'm sure you're an educated audience. There'll be some questions. So, usual rules of engagement. If you've got the microphone, you can ask a question. So, hands up, any volunteers. We always start slow. Okay, so I'll get to you.
You may have time for a shot. If I...
It's a question for both of you, actually, Tony, and for you, Simon. 32 years ago, I used to go to Vanderbilt's, and I actually sat in Tony's car, because I used to keep the Vanderbilt's there. I've got lots of stories about Vanderbilt's and going there, and I just wondered if I could have a moment of your time to go through with you.
Good evening, and thank you very much for coming and talking to us. I've just been reading a book about Archie Scott Brown, and your name is mentioned on several occasions there when you competed against him. Do you have any recollections you might like to share?
Any recollections of Archie Scott Brown? Yes, you did race against him.
Yeah, I did, yes. Well, he was a very, very good driver, and I don't know how he managed to do it, because of course he had problems with one arm, and he was very, very quick, and it was extremely sad that he lost his life at Spa, I think, at the fast left-hander, just before the hairpin there. And yes, he drove a Connaught too very well. He drove it after me and did it a lot of justice, but tended to be more in the shorter races and good with. I think he may have done the odd Grand Prix, but no, he had a considerable career ahead of him. Had he not had that sad accident at Spa. I don't know whether I can say too much more about him, but he was very, very good. And used to drive on the limit, he was almost a drifting expert.
And he was, I think it's generally agreed, isn't it, that there had been a race, Archie had dominated that particular class of short distance sports car racing. He was beaten a couple of weeks before, by Maston Gregory in a similar car. And I think at Spa, he was absolutely determined to stay ahead of Aston Gregory, so maybe he was driving on and over the limit.
Yes, over the limit, yes.
Okay, we've got another question here, gentlemen.
Another question.
Yeah, we're here.
Thanks very much. Hello.
Hello.
Tony, you won on the Nordschleife. Could you ever say that you have learned it perfectly? It's surely impossible, isn't it?
You won on the Nordschleife, Nürburgring.
I was.
You won
Yes.
on the Nürburgring,
Yes.
on the Nordschleife.
Yes, and in the Van Wall.
Indeed.
Yes, I also won
In the horse car races, yeah. So you did an enormous number of miles
Yes.
on the Nordschleife. Could you say that you ever really were able to learn it? All those myriad corners.
Yes. Well, you knew what was coming up, but I mean, there are said to be, I don't know who counted it, but there are said to be 175 corners there. So there's no way that you'd ever go around and think that you'd taken every corner at the maximum limit of adhesion, the fastest pace. There's no way, but I mean, no, I certainly knew what was coming up. And a principle that I had when I went to a new circuit, and of course absolutely essential to Nürburgring, was that I would find the corners that you couldn't mistake, identify definitely, and I would learn section. I would, as soon as I got to a corner I definitely knew, I would then learn that section until we got to another corner which I definitely knew, because otherwise, if you didn't have corners that you couldn't mistake, you would never get round to learning the whole circuit, if you follow me. And of course, if you took the wrong corner, you thought this was the corner was something else, you would have a very bad accident. So learning the circuit by in sections, not sections in doing one at a time, but doing in sections by continuous circulating on the circuit, but saying, oh yes, I know what this is, and now this, oh, I know what this is. And then if you had made a mistake on that section between the two corners that you had identified for sure, next time round you would correct that.
Thank you. Yeah, hold on, sir.
There's a question right down here. Steve is bringing you the microphone.
How did you go on with Mike Hawthorne?
How did you get on with Mike Hawthorne?
Oh, well, fine. I mean, we drove together in BRM in '56, and we never had an argument, and I didn't have any problem with him, but I have a principle of trying to get on with everybody, and usually successful, and I didn't have any problem with him, but I mean, you learn how to deal with people, I think, and you learn what to do and what not to do. So he was very cheerful and very very quick driver, and we had a lot of trouble with me because the cars were really just not up to.
But it's interesting. I mean, you've just used a wonderful adjective. Very polite adjective to describe Mike Hawthorne. You said he was cheerful.
Yeah.
I mean, here is a man who would think nothing of pouring a pint of beer over another driver's head after a race as sort of part of his general cheerfulness.
Yeah.
You are a very different character to Mike
I
Hawthorne.
never went to a pub with Mike, so maybe you have to see him in the pub to see him where he really was. But I'm being truthful in saying that I personally didn't have a problem. But, I do pride myself on trying to get on with people, and we never had a crossword.
I think
We've probably got time for one last question.
and then I'll be over to you, sir. Steve.
Thanks for a great presentation, gentlemen. Tony, could you tell us who the greatest driver you consider you raced against was, and why?
Who was the greatest driver that you raced against?
The greatest driver.
The greatest driver.
Greatest driver. Oh, well, that's no problem. Fangio.
What was so great about him?
Fangio, pardon?
What was so great about him?
Well, what does it? I mean, he was physically fantastic, you know, great, fantastic anticipation, fantastic judgment, and so on. But he had a tremendous sense of balance in, you know, driving a car. Certainly in those days was very much about balance. You had to synchronise yourself with the car, and you know, in drifting, when you were drifting a car in the 50s. It was, you know, Spa was the classic place for you drifted on the circuits, but Spa was the classic one, and you know, you'd going wide to a corner, and you'd put the car into a drift. A drift means that all four tyres are sliding relative to the road, and you have the car at an angle, and you drift on the line you have chosen, so that you clip, not literally touch, clip the apex of that corner, and this drift, which could aspire be 130, 140 miles an hour, this drift would just clip the apex of the corner, and you would have to judge it with just delicate control of the steering and the accelerator, so that the drift ran out of movement to the left just before you reach the outside of the circle on the left-hand side of the corner. So you were driving on a tightrope, almost by telepathy. You know, it's just such a delicate thing, and I mean, it was so exciting, actually drifting. And this car, and you are just one with the car, and driving and drifting on this tightrope, as it were. And as I say, you're not really having to do much with the steering wheel and the accelerator, because you set it up correctly for that particular corner. But and it's almost with mental telepathy, you're getting the car to move in fractions to ensure that you go through that corner on the best line at the best possible speed.
And Fangio was particularly good at that.
Oh yes, he was. But he didn't ever have to drive deliberately more than 10 tenths, whereas there's some drivers who didn't do that, and they got away with it. But I think obviously Sterling was very, very, very close to him, but I think Sterling had to try just that little bit harder, make that extra effort beyond perhaps his natural limits, whereas Fangio didn't.
Sterling always regards Fangio as the greatest.
Yes.
Perhaps a final note, because I know I'm getting signals from Steve, and we are going to have to wrap up now, but a final note which Tony may or may not have heard, but somebody asked Sterling Moss if he were the team manager of the Aston Martin sports car team, where you needed a pair of drivers for each car, who would if he had the choice of any drivers, who would he have as his number one pairing? And he said, no question, I would have Tony Brooks and Jim Clark. Now that would have been a hell of a good team. And sadly, we are there going to have to stop. Can we have a big hand, please, ladies and gentlemen?
I'd love this to go on all evening, but we are where we are. I'd like you to welcome the chairman of the Brooklands Museum Trust, Sir Jerry Asher, to join me here to do some presentations.
We've got some very special presentations this time. They are absolutely priceless. It's part of the thanking, our famous thanking. It will have more value than the Berlin Wall that was built. But actually, I ought to say that it's probably valueless, because otherwise you'll all be out there with your hammers. And that will not give us much pleasure. Tony, you've given us such a fantastic evening, as you have as well, Simon. It's those little vignettes that we will take back, those very special vignettes, told with such calmness and modesty. Just phenomenal. It's an expression of modesty that one doesn't normally associate with motor racing. But the extent that you've explained it, and your raison d'etre and your rule, and we wouldn't be having this evening if you had not kept it to that rule. So I think we're all glad that you did. So thank you so much for all you've done, all the pleasure you've given to all of us tonight, and we look forward maybe to a repeat occasion. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
An equally special piece.
One for me.
Absolutely.
Yes,
indeed.
Yeah, I have a feeling that John Cobb, his tyre just jumped over it. His tyre didn't actually hit it. I shall treasure that.
Thank you very much. And one for Steve as well, for all you've done for us. Yours seems to be a bit rougher on the underside. I don't know why that is. Thank you very much. And lastly, for that very, very special person who has kept Tony on the, dare I say, straight and narrow, or drifting around the bends.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I know we're very warm. A couple more things to do. We've got a very short auction to perform this evening. First item is a print by Michael Turner of Tony. Michael is here this evening and he's willing to countersign it once again. So can I start the bidding at £25, please? Any offers at 25? Yes, sir.